Hey, friends! I'm Megan, so glad you're here. We've got a great episode today. Let's get started.
The morning of the opportunity began like any other, with sunlight spilling through the window and the quiet hum of a world moving purposefully outside. She had been preparing for this moment for weeks, the culmination of effort, planning, and anticipation, yet there was an undercurrent of tension that lingered just beneath the surface. He had been advising her steadily, offering insights drawn from experience, knowledge, and careful observation. Each suggestion, each cautionary note, was rooted in an understanding of the landscape she hoped to navigate, a careful map drawn from the mistakes and successes of the past. Yet, in the quiet spaces between his words, she felt a familiar stir of independence and pride. She believed she could chart her own course, confident in her intelligence, resourcefulness, and intuition. The opportunity before her shimmered with possibility, a pivotal chance that could shape the trajectory of her career, her ambitions, and her sense of self. She understood the stakes fully, the potential to secure advancement, to prove her capabilities, and to establish herself on a new level of achievement. But with the stakes came the weight of responsibility, and with that weight came the question of whether to follow the guidance offered or to trust in her own judgment. In that moment, she felt the familiar tension between reliance and autonomy, between accepting help and asserting her independence. She weighed his advice carefully, considered the implications, and felt the magnetic pull of her own convictions, the belief that her path, chosen by herself, would lead to success. There was a sense of exhilaration in that decision making, a rush that came from asserting control over her own destiny, even in the face of cautionary voices. She imagined the triumph of proving herself capable, the satisfaction of navigating challenges with her own strategy, and the quiet pride that would accompany a well-executed plan. Yet beneath the surface of confidence, there were subtle threads of uncertainty, fleeting doubts that she quickly dismissed as unnecessary hesitations, the sort that often accompany ambition and risk-taking. As she prepared to act, she felt the surge of energy that accompanies choice, a rush of possibility that made every detail feel more intense, more consequential, and more alive. Her actions in those hours, the planning, the execution, and the strategic decisions, were infused with the belief that her method, her approach, and her intuition would carry her through. Each decision, each small step, seemed to reinforce her agency, her capability, and her independence. Yet as she moved forward, she remained unaware of the subtle currents set in motion by the guidance she had chosen to ignore. His advice, measured and thoughtful, was not simply suggestion but a scaffold, a support built from knowledge, foresight, and an understanding of patterns that she had yet to fully appreciate. She could sense his presence in the background, a quiet anchor, but she pushed it aside in favor of the thrill of self-reliance, the intoxicating idea that success could be claimed solely through her own intellect and perseverance. The early stages of action carried a sense of momentum, a forward drive that masked the nuances and risks inherent in the opportunity. She navigated each challenge with focus and determination, yet the absence of his guidance created subtle gaps, small oversights, and unanticipated complications that she failed to notice in the heat of her own initiative. The opportunity itself began to reveal its complexity, layers of difficulty and requirement that demanded careful navigation, attention to detail, and sometimes the humility to accept advice from others. She felt the tension between pride and pragmatism, between the desire to prove herself and the necessity of effective decision making. As hours turned into days, the consequences of her choice began to manifest incrementally: minor setbacks, overlooked considerations, and small miscalculations that aggregated into a larger pattern of missed potential. Her reflection on these moments was immediate yet incomplete, filtered through the lens of self-assurance and the continuing belief in her own strategy. She saw challenges and obstacles as temporary, surmountable through persistence and ingenuity, yet the subtle accumulation of missteps indicated that guidance she had disregarded might have mitigated some of these issues. Meanwhile, his actions, taken separately but informed by the very advice she had ignored, unfolded with a different rhythm. He moved through the same landscape with foresight, precision, and the benefit of prior experience, translating guidance into successful outcomes. Each measured step, each calculated decision, and each outcome achieved without complication contrasted sharply with her own trajectory. She began to notice the quiet divergence, the separation of paths that had started from a single point of decision, to heed advice or to follow her own instincts. This awareness introduced a complex mix of emotions: pride in her independence, regret at early miscalculations, admiration for his success, and a subtle but growing recognition of the consequences of ignoring counsel. She reflected on the nature of opportunity, the interplay of timing, decision making, and external guidance, and how easily the alignment of these factors can tip the balance between success and failure. Each consideration deepened her understanding of relational dynamics, the role of trust, and the importance of balance in self-reliance with receptiveness to insight. The morning faded into afternoon, and she continued to navigate the unfolding challenges, fully engaged in the process, but increasingly aware of the quiet but insistent contrast between her progress and his accomplishments. She felt the tension of watching someone succeed in the very context she had mishandled, a reminder that opportunity is fragile, success is contingent, and the guidance of those who understand the terrain is invaluable. Reflection became both analytical and emotional. She traced the sequence of choices, noting where her pride had overruled prudence, and considered the subtle ways in which minor decisions compounded into tangible outcomes. Memory intertwined with anticipation, as she envisioned the potential trajectory had she chosen differently, and each imagined scenario reinforced the delicate balance between autonomy, collaboration, and the receptiveness required to navigate complex opportunities effectively. By the time the day ended, the contours of consequence were beginning to settle into clarity. Her independence had been exercised fully, yet at the cost of opportunity. His adherence to guidance had yielded success, and she was left to reconcile pride with regret, autonomy with oversight, and ambition with humility. The chapter closed with a recognition that decisions, even those made with confidence and intention, are rarely isolated, that guidance and experience are tools whose value becomes most apparent in retrospect, and that the path to growth often begins at the intersection of misjudgment, observation, and reflection. In the days that followed her decision, the immediate consequences began to manifest in ways that were both subtle and insistent, revealing the complexities she had initially overlooked. Each task she undertook, each step she attempted to navigate independently, carried an undercurrent of tension that she had not anticipated. At first, the setbacks seemed minor, almost inconsequential, easily rationalized as temporary obstacles or the natural friction of pursuing something ambitious. Yet, over time, these minor missteps compounded, forming a pattern that gradually reshaped her sense of control and confidence. She noticed that the choices she had made in isolation, while technically sound in some respects, lacked the foresight and perspective that his advice had provided. Small miscalculations in timing, misjudgments of priority, and overlooked details began to reveal themselves, quietly eroding the advantage she had assumed her independent approach would confer. The emotional impact was subtle at first, a fleeting pang of doubt here, a moment of uncertainty there, but it grew steadily, threading through her consciousness and inflecting her decision-making with a cautious awareness she had not experienced before. She found herself re-examining her rationale, wondering if the pride that had propelled her to dismiss guidance had also blinded her to critical considerations. The initial excitement of autonomy gave way to a growing recognition of the gaps between intention and outcome, between effort and effect. She began to observe the world around her with heightened sensitivity, noticing how minor variables, which she had once considered negligible, now exerted a significant influence on outcomes. These observations extended beyond the mechanics of the opportunity itself, affecting how she interacted with others, allocated her time, and perceived the flow of events. Each day became a subtle negotiation between confidence and caution, autonomy and collaboration, intention and receptivity. She became increasingly attuned to the nuances of her own thought processes, recognizing patterns of overconfidence and blind spots that had previously gone unnoticed. Reflection deepened as she considered the ripple effects of her decision, tracing how a single choice to ignore advice had set in motion a series of consequences that affected not only the immediate opportunity but also her broader sense of competence and self-efficacy. Simultaneously, she observed his progress from a distance, noting how he navigated the same challenges with a calm, measured approach that seemed almost effortless. His ability to anticipate complications, leverage resources, and make strategic choices highlighted the value of the guidance she had set aside. Each milestone he achieved served as a quiet but persistent reminder of what might have been had she integrated his advice into her own plan. The contrast between their paths generated a complex mixture of emotions: admiration for his skill, frustration at her own misjudgment, and a growing awareness of how easily pride can cloud judgment. She reflected on the relational dynamics at play, recognizing that decisions made in defiance of guidance can influence not only outcomes but also trust, perception, and the subtle currents of interpersonal interaction. Her internal dialogue became more nuanced, weighing independence against collaboration, ambition against humility, and the drive to prove herself against the practical wisdom embedded in his suggestions. As she worked through the unfolding consequences, she began to experiment with micro-adjustments, small recalibrations of strategy aimed at mitigating risk and realigning her efforts with realistic outcomes. These adjustments were tentative and often accompanied by a heightened sensitivity to feedback, as she sought to recover ground without overstepping or repeating previous missteps. Observation became a central tool in her approach, not only of external circumstances but of her own reactions, emotional responses, and cognitive patterns. She noted moments of overconfidence, impulsivity, or dismissal of critical details, using them as markers for reflection and recalibration. The pattern of accumulating consequences revealed a larger truth: that success is rarely a matter of raw effort alone, but a complex interplay of timing, guidance, execution, and adaptability. She became increasingly conscious of the ways in which humility, receptivity, and strategic listening can amplify effectiveness, while pride and unilateral decision-making carry inherent risk. In parallel, she reflected on the subtle emotional shifts occurring between her and him: the quiet acknowledgement of his competence, the unspoken contrast between their respective outcomes, and the internalized recognition of her own miscalculations. These reflections were tinged with a mix of regret, respect, and a growing understanding of the relational dynamics of mentorship, collaboration, and shared experience. Over time, she developed a methodical approach to analyzing each step, integrating both her own initiative and the insights she had previously dismissed. This approach required patience, attention to detail, and the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths about her prior choices. Each day offered lessons in resilience, adaptation, and the nuanced art of balancing independence with receptivity. The accumulation of small setbacks, tempered by reflection and microcorrections, gradually shaped her awareness, emotional regulation, and strategic thinking. By the end of the second chapter, she had begun to internalize the broader implications that decisions carry consequences far beyond their immediate context, that guidance from others can be a critical tool rather than a constraint, and that the interplay of autonomy and collaboration is essential for navigating complex opportunities successfully. The chapter closed with a sense of emerging clarity, a recognition that mistakes are not only inevitable but instructive, and that the careful integration of insight, reflection, and humility is necessary for both personal growth and relational harmony. As the weeks unfolded, the consequences of her earlier decision became increasingly apparent, casting a shadow over both her confidence and her perception of control. The initial setbacks, minor and easily dismissed, had begun to accumulate into a more complex pattern that revealed the depth of the impact caused by ignoring his advice. She noticed how opportunities she had anticipated with excitement were slipping away, how timing that might have been advantageous was lost, and how small errors, overlooked in the rush of independent decision making, compounded to produce outcomes she had not foreseen. Each day brought fresh awareness of the delicate interplay between planning, execution, and foresight, highlighting the value of the guidance she had set aside. In observing his actions, she saw a stark contrast. Where she had struggled with uncertainty and minor setbacks, he moved deliberately, strategically, and with a quiet confidence that spoke to both preparation and receptiveness. His success, unfolding steadily and unassumingly, became an unspoken measure against which her own efforts were increasingly weighed. She experienced a growing mixture of emotions: admiration, envy, frustration, and regret as she witnessed the tangible results of his choices and the path she had declined to follow. This awareness forced her to confront the ways in which pride and self-assurance can distort judgment, leading to decisions that favor independence over wisdom. She began to trace the cumulative effect of her choices, examining the sequence of moments where a different decision could have altered the outcome, and recognizing the subtle but persistent influence of ego on decision-making processes. Each reflection deepened her understanding of cause and effect, revealing how minor lapses in judgment, small deviations from sound advice, and moments of overconfidence can shape not only immediate outcomes but also long-term trajectories. The relational dimension of the experience became increasingly salient. She observed how her dismissal of guidance had shifted the dynamic between herself and him, introducing subtle tension, unspoken acknowledgement of disparity, and a quiet reassessment of competence and judgment. She noted the impact of these dynamics on collaboration, communication, and trust, understanding that interpersonal relationships are entwined with professional or strategic decisions, and that the consequences of pride extend beyond individual failure to affect shared engagement and perception. In parallel, she reflected on the cognitive and emotional processes that had guided her decisions: the reliance on instinct, the impulse to assert autonomy, and the desire to prove her capabilities independently. She recognized the limitations inherent in these approaches when untempered by external perspective, experience, and foresight. The pattern of missteps illuminated the necessity of integrating multiple sources of insight, balancing self-directed action with receptivity to counsel, and remaining attuned to both immediate and long-term implications of decisions. She began to identify the subtle learning points embedded in each error, translating frustration into analysis and regret into insight. Each miscalculation provided an opportunity to examine assumptions, evaluate methodology, and refine judgment, forming a foundation for both personal and professional growth. Observation of his successes offered further lessons: the efficacy of deliberate action, the benefits of strategic listening, and the power of timing aligned with guidance. She began to internalize the understanding that expertise and experience, when considered thoughtfully, can serve as accelerants for achievement rather than constraints on autonomy. Emotional regulation became a central focus as she navigated the tension between pride, envy, and the desire to reclaim momentum. She recognized that emotional responses can cloud judgment, distort perception, and amplify the sense of failure, requiring conscious management and reflective practice to maintain clarity and effectiveness. The chapter also examined the interplay of anticipation and outcome, illustrating how expectations shape perception, influence motivation, and inform subsequent decisions. She observed how the divergence between her outcomes and his successes underscored the importance of humility, strategic alignment, and the willingness to integrate external guidance into her decision-making framework. Over time, this awareness fostered both cognitive and emotional growth, highlighting the interconnected nature of self-perception, relational dynamics, and achievement. She considered the lessons embedded in the evolving narrative, the balance between independence and receptivity, the consequences of prideful dismissal of advice, and the ongoing need for attentiveness, analysis, and reflection in pursuing opportunities. Each day became a microcosm of these dynamics, offering repeated opportunities to observe, adjust, and integrate insights into behavior and strategy. By the end of the chapter, she had cultivated a nuanced understanding of cause and effect, autonomy and guidance, and the subtleties of relational and professional interplay. She recognized that success and failure are rarely isolated, that pride and oversight can shape trajectories as much as talent and effort, and that deliberate attention to both external counsel and internal reflection is essential for navigating complex opportunities. The chapter closed with a quiet, emergent awareness that the lessons of failure are as instructive as the experiences of success, that awareness and humility are catalysts for growth, and that the careful integration of insight, strategy, and relational intelligence is indispensable for achieving meaningful outcomes. As the weeks progressed, the contrast between her efforts and his success became more pronounced, revealing the consequences of choices made in prideful independence. Each step he took in following the guidance she had dismissed seemed deliberate, measured, and efficient, producing results that highlighted both the value of foresight and the pitfalls of overconfidence. She began to observe the details of his process, noting how preparation, adherence to advice, and strategic patience allowed him to navigate challenges that had thwarted her. Every milestone he achieved served as a quiet mirror, reflecting what might have been had she integrated his counsel into her own approach. This growing awareness produced a complex mix of emotions: admiration for his capability, envy for his progress, and a gnawing recognition of her own misjudgment. She started to examine the nuances of her decision making with sharper focus, identifying the points where pride had overridden pragmatism and where self assurance had blinded her to potential pitfalls. Each misstep, though minor in isolation, formed a pattern of compounded consequences that reshaped not only her trajectory but her perception of competence, opportunity, and relational dynamics. She considered how easily the interplay of ego and ambition could distort judgment, emphasizing that the confidence she once relied upon as a strength had, in this instance, become a liability. Reflection deepened as she assessed the relational dimension, the ways her dismissal of advice had altered the dynamic between herself and him, creating subtle tension, quiet distance, and unspoken acknowledgement of disparity. The interaction between professional misjudgment and interpersonal consequence became increasingly clear, illustrating how decisions ripple outward beyond their immediate context. She noted that each attempt to regain momentum was tempered by caution, the awareness that prior errors demanded careful, deliberate action to avoid compounding the situation further. In these moments, she learned to distinguish between decisive independence and impulsive stubbornness, recognizing that autonomy must be exercised in balance with discernment and receptivity to experience. Her observation of his progress offered lessons not only in strategy and execution but also in patience, timing, and the subtle art of leveraging counsel to enhance outcomes. She internalized the understanding that guidance is not a constraint on creativity or autonomy, but a resource that, when respected, amplifies effectiveness and minimizes risk. Emotional awareness became critical as she navigated her responses, managing the tension between pride, regret, and admiration, and learning to translate feelings of envy into insight rather than resentment. She recognized that emotional regulation is essential for maintaining clarity, objectivity, and the capacity to act strategically. The chapter explored the accumulation of small behaviors and decisions, illustrating how patterns emerge over time to shape both opportunity and perception. Each minor misstep, each ignored suggestion, had contributed incrementally to her missed outcomes, emphasizing the power of compounding effect in professional and personal contexts. She examined the cognitive processes underlying decision making, identifying tendencies toward impulsivity, overestimation of capability and underestimation of complexity. Reflection on these patterns highlighted the importance of integrating diverse perspectives, remaining open to counsel, and calibrating action with strategic insight. The temporal aspect of consequence became increasingly salient. The passage of weeks revealed that initial dismissals of advice could manifest as concrete disparities in outcome, underscoring the long-term impact of seemingly small choices. She began to develop adaptive strategies, combining her independent initiative with more deliberate consideration of guidance, observing feedback, and making adjustments informed by reflection and experience. Each day became an exercise in measured action, careful evaluation, and conscious recalibration, fostering growth in both skill and self-awareness. She also observed how relational dynamics evolved in response to professional divergence. Subtle shifts in respect, communication, and mutual understanding emerged as she recognized the validity of his approach and the tangible results it produced. These observations reinforced the lessons of humility, attentiveness, and the interplay between autonomy and collaboration. By the end of the chapter, she had cultivated a heightened awareness of the consequences of choice, the value of counsel, and the importance of strategic alignment between action and insight. She recognized that opportunities are rarely isolated, that guidance and experience provide critical frameworks for success, and that personal growth emerges from both the exercise of agency and the thoughtful integration of external perspectives. The chapter concluded with the understanding that careful observation, reflection, and adaptive strategy are essential to navigating complex landscapes, and that the interplay of independence and receptivity shapes not only outcomes but the evolution of skill, judgment, and relational awareness over time. As the consequences of her earlier decisions continued to unfold, she became acutely aware of the patterns that had emerged from her initial dismissal of guidance. Each day offered new evidence of how minor misjudgments had accumulated, shaping both her progress and her perception of competence. She reflected on the ways in which pride and overconfidence had steered her away from the path of measured decision-making, leading to small oversights that now aggregated into significant setbacks. The realization of these patterns was both sobering and instructive, compelling her to confront the limitations of her approach and the importance of balancing independence with strategic receptivity. She observed his ongoing success with a mixture of admiration, envy, and reflection, noting how the deliberate integration of guidance had allowed him to navigate challenges with ease, efficiency, and foresight. Each achievement he earned served as a quiet reminder of the value of collaboration, mentorship, and the willingness to consider perspectives beyond her own. This observation prompted deeper introspection. She began to analyze the cognitive and emotional processes that had informed her previous decisions, recognizing tendencies toward impulsivity, overestimation of ability, and underappreciation of complexity. She considered how these tendencies, while often useful in moments of decisive action, had, in this context, contributed to a widening gap between her intended outcomes and reality. The psychological weight of these realizations was substantial. She grappled with the interplay of regret, self-awareness, and the challenge of recalibrating her approach in the midst of ongoing consequences. Her reflections extended to the relational dimension, recognizing how her actions had influenced not only her trajectory but also the dynamics between herself and him. She considered the subtle shifts in respect, trust, and perception that emerged as a result of her earlier choices, noting that relational equilibrium is influenced as much by patterns of behavior and accountability as by explicit communication. In response to these insights, she began to experiment with deliberate interventions designed to recalibrate her trajectory. She focused on integrating lessons from past missteps into her daily decision-making, combining her initiative with informed attention to strategy, timing, and external input. These interventions were tentative at first, requiring patience and careful observation of both outcomes and her own responses. Over time, she noticed incremental changes, minor improvements in execution, better alignment of actions with desired results, and subtle reductions in error that reinforced confidence while tempering impulsivity. Each step reinforced the understanding that growth is cumulative, shaped by consistent reflection, adaptive strategy, and an openness to learning from both success and failure. She also reflected on the emotional landscape of this process, recognizing that managing feelings of frustration, envy, and regret was as important as technical adjustments in strategy. Emotional regulation became an essential component of her approach, allowing her to maintain clarity, focus, and objectivity while navigating ongoing challenges. The interplay of cognitive insight and emotional awareness gradually allowed her to act with greater deliberation and foresight. She observed that each choice now carried a heightened sense of consequence, informed by the lessons of prior errors and the visibility of his contrasting success. This awareness fostered a more nuanced approach to opportunity, one in which initiative was tempered by reflection, autonomy balanced with receptivity, and ambition aligned with practical strategy. She also noted the role of timing and patience, understanding that immediate correction of errors is rarely possible, and that sustained, thoughtful engagement is necessary to reclaim momentum and rebuild alignment with her goals. Each day became a microcosm for testing adaptive strategies, observing outcomes, and refining approaches, creating a feedback loop of insight, action, and recalibration. The relational dimension continued to evolve in tandem with professional reflection. She recognized that acknowledging the validity of his approach, learning from his execution, and integrating his insights were crucial not only for outcomes but for the maintenance of mutual respect and effective collaboration. Over weeks, the interplay of reflection, adaptation, and observation cultivated resilience, strategic acumen, and emotional intelligence. She internalized the broader lessons of this experience, that opportunities are shaped as much by humility, attentiveness, and learning from others as by initiative, that mistakes can be instructive rather than solely punitive, and that growth arises from the careful integration of insight, reflection, and deliberate action. By the conclusion of this chapter, she had developed a sophisticated understanding of cause and effect, strategy and humility, and the dynamics of relational and professional interplay. She recognized that progress requires not only effort and skill but also insight, self-awareness, and the capacity to learn from both one's own experiences and the observed successes of others. The chapter ended with a sense of emerging clarity, that the consequences of pride are instructive, the path to recalibration is deliberate, and that measured attention to both internal and external cues is essential for navigating opportunities effectively and maintaining relational and professional equilibrium. By the time she reached the sixth chapter of this unfolding journey, the contours of consequence, reflection, and growth had fully crystallized, revealing the depth of learning embedded in the experience. The opportunity she had lost lingered in her thoughts, not as a source of persistent regret alone, but as a lens through which she could examine decision-making, strategy, and the interplay of pride and receptivity. Each passing day offered the chance to integrate past lessons into present action, to observe, analyze, and refine her approach to both professional challenges and interpersonal dynamics. She noticed how her perspective had shifted. What once felt like a singular failure now appeared as a sequence of teachable moments, each revealing insights about timing, judgment, and the value of external guidance. The contrast between her own outcomes and his continued success remained a vivid backdrop, a reminder of the stakes involved and the practical consequences of choices made in defiance of counsel. Yet, rather than fostering resentment, this contrast had begun to inform a more sophisticated understanding of autonomy, collaboration, and the interdependence inherent in human endeavor. She reflected on the intricate balance between independence and receptivity, recognizing that effective adaptive action is rarely purely self-directed and that strategic engagement with the perspectives of others often amplifies the likelihood of success. This awareness extended beyond professional considerations, shaping her relational intelligence and the ways in which she engaged with peers, mentors, and colleagues. The subtleties of pride, humility, and trust became central to her reflections, highlighting the delicate interplay between asserting capability and remaining open to influence. Each day, she practiced translating observation into adaptive behavior, learning to adjust plans without sacrificing initiative, to incorporate insight without undermining confidence, and to navigate uncertainty with both courage and prudence. The emotional landscape of the chapter was complex, interweaving regret with appreciation, envy with admiration, and frustration with insight. She confronted the discomfort of seeing someone succeed where she had faltered, examining the roots of her pride and the cognitive biases that had influenced her early decisions. These reflections fostered resilience, teaching her that failure, when observed thoughtfully, can serve as a catalyst for growth rather than a permanent limitation. In parallel, she tracked the ripple effects of her earlier misjudgment, observing how small lapses in timing, overlooked considerations, and the dismissal of strategic advice had compounded into concrete outcomes. This awareness underscored the interconnectedness of action and consequence, revealing that even minor decisions carry weight and that attentiveness, humility, and foresight are critical components of sustained achievement. She also reflected on the ways in which observation and learning could transform future opportunities, creating a template for approaching challenges with both autonomy and discernment. The integration of these lessons became a daily practice, involving careful attention to detail, iterative reflection, and a willingness to modify approach based on feedback, results, and insight. Over time, she recognized patterns in her own behavior, identifying tendencies toward impulsivity, overconfidence, and dismissal of external input. These patterns, once unchecked, had contributed to her earlier setbacks, but through deliberate observation and adjustment, she began to mitigate their influence, cultivating a more balanced and strategic approach. The relational dimension of this journey remained central. She acknowledged the subtle ways her choices had influenced perceptions, trust, and mutual engagement, understanding that repair and growth extend beyond outcomes to encompass relational dynamics and the cultivation of credibility, respect, and collaboration. The chapter also explored the temporal aspect of consequence and learning, emphasizing that reflection, adaptation, and skill development are ongoing processes that unfold over weeks and months rather than moments. Each interaction, decision, and observation contributed incrementally to her growth, reinforcing the principle that sustained attention and iterative learning are essential for both personal and professional development. As she observed his continuing success, she reframed the experience not as a benchmark of her own inadequacy, but as a model for understanding strategy, timing, and the integration of guidance. This perspective fostered a sense of empowerment rooted in insight rather than comparison, allowing her to approach future opportunities with the combination of initiative, awareness, and humility. By the close of the chapter, she had cultivated a nuanced understanding of the interplay between action, consequence, and relational dynamics, recognizing that effective navigation of opportunities requires a delicate balance of independence, receptivity, and reflective practice. She had internalized the lessons of her experience, that pride unchecked can distort judgment, that guidance is a tool rather than a constraint, and that resilience, adaptability, and sustained attention are foundational to success. The chapter concluded with a sense of resolution tempered by awareness, emphasizing that growth emerges from the thoughtful integration of experience, insight, and strategy, and that the path forward is defined not by past missteps but by the capacity to learn, adapt, and engage intentionally in the pursuit of opportunity, mastery, and meaningful achievement.
Thanks for watching. It means a lot. Share the video, and I'll see you soon.